Hi there. In this practice, we are going to move our spine in a range of different ways in an effort to get the back and really the whole torso moving well. We're going to start on the ground with a little bit of mobilization work for the full length of the spine. And in order to do that effectively, we either need some kind of block at home. If you have a cork block or something that is hard, then I would recommend having a blanket over the top of it or a towel over the top of it just to soften it a little bit. Otherwise, a soft block, a foam block, is also a really good tool. And if you don't have either of those things, you can just use a blanket instead. And if you do use a blanket, you want to fold it up so that it is, a little bit thick, but then in terms of its width, it's relatively thin. And then you would be using this instead of one of the blocks, okay? So to begin with, we're going to start on the ground. I'm going to use this block today because it's my favorite. But at home you use whatever tools you have. The way that we're going to start is focusing movement directly into the intervertebral spaces. And we do that on the edge of the block, okay? And that's the reason why I would recommend, if this is your first time doing something like this, you have some kind of extra padding on it, or you use a softer tool like a foam block or a blanket. Now, what that means is we're going to start at the bottom of the thoracic spine. So if you think of the spine as the neck, the mid and upper back, and then the lower back, we're going to focus on the mid and upper back portion with this work to start with. And you can have the block on its lowest setting. If you do, I would recommend having it in alignment with the spine. Otherwise, you can set it up on any setting that you think might work for you. I would generally recommend, though, if this is the first time you're doing this, to start with the lowest setting and see how that feels, okay? And then we're going to come down onto the block and you're going to position it so that it's directly underneath the spine. And then you want the first section, we're starting nice and low, so you want the first section to be towards the lowest ribs. And then the top of the block is at around about that height. And then what you're going to do is going to come down slowly onto the block, and you're going to notice what height is going to be good for you. If this is plenty of sensation, stay here. If you could use a little bit more sensation, you can adjust the height of the block accordingly. Also, if this is really intense, you might want to back off a little bit. What that might look like is, instead of reversing out, you might actually push into the feet and lift the hips a little bit. You might stay a little bit higher and hang out here. Otherwise, what we're going to do is we're actually going to lift and lower the hips as much as possible. And what that's going to do is, at the point of the edge of the block, it's actually going to drive a little bit more movement into that specific joint. So you do that a couple of times, and then come back up, move the block up a little bit further, and then repeat. Come on down. Try to have your shoulders on the floor. Again, if that means the hips have to lift, then lift the hips. Once you've found that new position, move through a lifting and a lowering of the hips to isolate a little bit of movement at that portion of the spine. Do that a few times. And then come on back down. Move the block superiorly. Come on back down onto the block. And repeat. Feeling the block incrementally further up the spine. Lifting and lowering the hips, thinking about that point of contact with the block as being your pivot point. Doing this a few times in each spot. And then repeating, coming on up, moving the block superiorly. At a certain point, when you get to the shoulder blades or the scapulae, you might need to turn it on its side onto its mid setting. You may not, and that's okay. And then coming on down. Please note that this can be quite intense, and so at home, doing this without specific one-on-one guidance, I would strongly recommend that you, especially if it's new, play on the side of lower sensation to start with. And then as familiarity grows, as you repeat this video, you might step into a little bit more sensation each time, based on the results of how you feel from the previous attempt. Incrementally shifting up. Now I'm sort of in between the shoulder blades, in between the scapulae. Lifting and lowering, driving that movement between those particular vertebrae at the edge of the block. You could also try, if you'd like to, you could also try lifting the head off the floor at the same time as the hips. And that'll create even more mobilization through that particular spot. After a few of those, move the block superiorly again. You can take your options and find a little bit of movement here. Especially up in towards this upper portion of the back, we tend to be quite immobile. We don't tend to have a lot of movement here. And so working specifically with this type of isolation can be intense, but it also can be very necessary. Move the block up a little bit more. Now getting towards the upper portion of the shoulder blades. I've maybe got one more spot after this one, based on where the block is right now for me. And so then we're going to do about one more movement. Coming up, shimmy the block superiorly, and then come on back down. Lifting and lowering the hips. And then if you've got more space, if you've got plenty more spots to do at home, pause the video, continue until you reach the top of the shoulder blade. Then once you have reached that point, remove the block, come on down to the floor fully. And then bring the knees and float them up and away from the floor. Straighten the legs as much as you can, and then lift the hands up towards the feet. Lift them so much that you protract your shoulder blades, and that therefore the shoulders float away from the floor. The intent here is to take away the support of the shoulders being on the floor. So lift the shoulders up and away from the ground, keep the head down on the floor. And then just ever so slightly start to take the legs off to one side. And then you'll notice at a certain point that there'll be a tipping point. And if you go past that, you'll fall to the side, okay? The idea is we're trying to find that edge point, and because we don't have our shoulders on the ground to support us, we have to engage the deeper core muscles in order to stabilize us and keep us there. And then bring your legs back through the middle, and then take your legs off to the other side. Again, keep your shoulders off the floor. There will be a tendency to want to ground them again in order to keep your stability here, but I would encourage you to drive that stability from the middle of your body. Repeat, go to the other side, try to find that edge, keep the shoulders lifted, come back through the middle, off to the other side, find that edge, pause there, one more each side. Approaching your edge, noticing that tipping point, seeing if you can pause there. And then the last one on the second side. Keeping those shoulders lifted until you get the legs back to the middle. Bend the legs for a moment. Set your arms out on the ground in a T formation at about 90 degrees from your body. Turn the palms so that they're down on the floor. You're going to use your arms this time. Use your arms, use your shoulders, use everything to keep this movement nice and slow. Straighten the legs back out as much as you can, okay? They don't have to be so far up. You can take them wherever is possible for you. And then with the assistance of pressing the hands and arms down into the floor, really slowly lower towards a twist. As much of a twist as you feel comfortable doing. If you make it to the floor, great. Don't hang out there. We're going to come all the way back up right away, pressing into the arms in order to get there. Switch sides. Try to make this movement slower than you want to. The benefit is in the process of getting there and then the process of getting out. So don't be too worried about the end point and where you end up. Pause there for just half a second and then reverse back out. Second round, come back to the first side, lowering the feet towards the floor. A little tap, or float them in space wherever they end up, and then reverse back out. Second side, nice and slow, lowering, 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 getting to your ultimate end point, and then slowly reversing back up. One more each side. Make it super duper slow. Move with control. Final side. And then bend the knees when you're back in the middle. Set the feet down. And on the floor here, we're going to add a little bit of a roll into the spine now. So have the feet at a comfortable distance apart, keep the legs bent, and we're just going to start bringing the spine into some flexion and then some extension. The idea here is you think of your sacrum or your pelvis as almost like a point of rolling, a rolling point. So just rocking back and forth, lifting the lumbar spine off the floor in extension, and then pressing the lumbar spine down into the floor in flexion. Do that a couple of times. And then we're going to request more of the spine gets involved. So then as you bring the spine into flexion, press the feet down into the floor and lift the pelvis so that the flexion comes up a little bit higher in the spine. And then reverse that down piece by piece onto the floor and come into a little bit of extension. Next time, add in a little bit more. Roll into the flexion, press into the feet, lift the hips off the floor, and bring a little bit more of the spine with you into that flexion. And then reverse out piece by piece. We come down, we then move into extension. Lift the lumbar spine off the floor. The next time, you got it, we go a little bit more. Add in a little bit more of the spine into this movement so that we're lifting the hips a little bit more and we're finding flexion in a different portion of the spine. And then lower piece by piece. And then extension of the spine. Repeat. Adding in a little bit more. Coming up now into the mid-back. And then reversing down. Little extension. 2 more. As you add these 2 more, we're going to try and cover the rest of the spine nice and slowly, rolling up piece by piece, and then rolling all the way back down, section by section. A little bit of extension. 1 more. Roll the spine up and away from the floor. All the way up. And then we roll all the way back down. Piece by piece. Once the hips make it back down to the floor, we're going to come on up to an all fours position. Moving those props out of the way. Set yourself up in all fours and then press into one hand, lift the other one off the floor and then reach it up towards the sky as much as you can. And then we thread it underneath, but without letting the shoulder come to the floor. And then we do that a couple more times. Lift the arm up, press the other hand into the ground. You can even press the fingertips into the ground and get those forearm muscles engaging. Send the top arm through and underneath. 1 more. Lift that arm up. Open up. A little rotation through the spine. And then this time set the shoulder down nice and softly. And think about adding a little bit more rotation through the spinal column. Couple of deep breaths here. And then slowly reversing out, switching sides. Lift the opposite hand up, press your grounded hand into the floor, and then send the arm through underneath, reach it out as far as you can, hover the shoulder, and repeat 2 more times. Lift that arm up, open up wide, thread the needle, hover the shoulder, and then one more. Before we thread it through underneath, hover the shoulder, and then gently set the shoulder down. Add in a little bit more rotation through the spine. Take some nice deep breaths here through the nose. And then reverse back out. A little bit of wrist warm up, just because we're going to add a little bit of weight to the hands. So press the fingers into the floor, the full length of the fingers. Lift the heels of the hands up and away from the ground. And then really slowly lower the heels of the hands back to the floor. 2 more of these. Nice and slowly lowering. One more. And then take a seat for a moment. Shake out the wrists. We're going to do that again. You have the option to turn the hands out so that the fingers are pointing to the sides, and that can target things a little bit differently. You could also repeat those ones that we just did, just to get a little bit of heat going in the forearms. Slowly lower the heels of the hands and repeat. 3 more. Two. Try to make that lowering process even slower. 1 more. And then take a seat again. Shake out the hands, the forearms. And then take a moment in this seat just to find a little bit of lateral flexion of the spine. So you can do it with your legs folded underneath you, or you can cross your legs, or you can have your legs out in front, as straight as they can go. With either variation, what I'm going to request is that we go from side to side, nice and gradually, and that whichever variation you use, you're going to make the hand on the floor either very light or hover it off the floor. With the legs out, you get a little bit more support from the rest of the legs. With the legs folded in, your torso is going to have to create a little bit more of that support for you. Regardless, moving from side to side, finding that tipping point, and pausing there for just a moment, and then switching sides. One more each side. And then we're going to come on back to all fours. And we're going to create some movement with our torso that sort of combines some of the stuff that we've done now. So to start with, a little bit of isolation, and then we'll piece it together. Flexion of the spine. Try and get as much flexion as you possibly can. So push the floor away from you, both from your knees and from your hands, you may look towards your knees as well. And then extension of the spine. As you come into extension of the spine, instead of just letting it be passive extension, see if you can actively draw your sternum in between your arms and look forward and draw the hands without moving them, an effort of drawing the hands back towards your knees. And that gets the muscles of extension of the spine active instead of gravity just moving us into that position. Okay, so we've got flexion and extension. And then we're going to do hip and shoulder towards one another in lateral flexion. One side at a time. Before we then piece all of that together. Starting in flexion, push the floor away, and then we're going to go through lateral flexion. So you arc into lateral flexion, one hip and shoulder towards one another. Keeping the arms straight, we're then going to work ourselves into extension of the spine, actively pulling the sternum in between the arms. And then we're going to arc up and through the opposite side lateral flexion. Keeping the arms straight, we're going to continue the arc up and around through to flexion of the spine. And again, continue the arc through lateral flexion, arms stay straight. As you do this, make sure you're pressing the fingertips down into the floor. Arc down through extension of the spine, make it active. Up through lateral flexion on the opposite side. And then when we get back to flexion, switch directions. We're going to do 2 of those in the opposite direction. Lateral flexion, and then we arc down through extension of the spine, up the other side, through lateral flexion, all the way up, through flexion of the spine. One more. Arc down through lateral flexion, hip to shoulder. Continue that arc through to extension of the spine. Make it a circle. Continue up through the opposite side lateral flexion, hip to shoulder. And then all the way up through flexion of the spine. And then come back to a neutral position. Take a moment, you might shimmy out the wrists, shake out the hands. And then we're going to come on up into our downward facing dog. Press the fingertips down, lift the hips up. Try to make the shoulder girdle nice and strong here, avoiding letting it rest. It's not a resting position. And then just step the right foot forward. Come into a nice lunge position. You might need to scooch the foot along in front of you. And then opening into a little bit of rotation. The same leg, so the right leg that came forward, the right arm we're going to lift up through to the ceiling or through to the sky. And then we're going to try and get the other hand to float off the floor in that rotation. Take a couple of breaths. And on the second exhalation, nice and slowly, set that hand down on the floor and start to walk the front foot back. You pause wherever the foot feels like it is okay to support you. It might be halfway back, it might be further. Maybe you come to a half plank. And then what we're going to do is some lateral flexion of the spine, assisted on the way down by gravity, and resisted on the way up by gravity. So trying to lower in your side plank, trying to lower the hips all the way to the floor, or as close to the floor as you can, and then working the reverse movement, nice and slow. 3 of those, so we've got 1 more to go. Again, your top foot can be wherever you'd like it to be for the support. And then we reverse out, come to a plank, lower all the way down to the floor. Find a little bit of extension through the spine. You might like to tent the fingertips and pull the fingertips back towards you. And then lower, reverse back up to downward facing dog. Then we're going to step the left foot forward, or the opposite foot to what you just did. Scooch it forward into a nice long lunge position, and then the same leg that's forward, that arm comes up to the sky. And then the fingertips on the floor get really, really light, and they hover. After 2 slow, solid breaths there, set that hand back down on the floor, make it strong. Walk that front foot as far back as you'd like. You might keep it halfway and move through your spinal lateral flexion, or any distance back, maybe into a side plank, before we add in our lateral flexion of the spine, working the hips towards the floor as much as possible, and then lifting them back up. This is the second one. Have a bit of fun with it. Third one to finish. Lift those hips nice and high. And then plank, nice and slowly down to the floor. A little bit of cobra, extension through the spine, and then press up and back to your downward facing dog. Take a moment here, find a little bit of movement. You might take the hips from side to side in a little bit of lateral flexion. And then walk your hands back to your feet and come into a little bit of a squat. Take a moment here, let your blood pressure equalize, and then come on up to standing. And then take a nice big wide stance. Bend into the knees, let the feet point in the direction that feels good or best for your ankles and knees. And then bring the hands onto the inside of the thighs, and we're just going to do a little dip of the shoulder. You may remember these video clips from, I think, the 70s or 80s. The only thing that's missing is a leotard. So we're going to dip that shoulder in and drive rotation through the spine. And then switch sides. Driving rotation through the spine, using your legs as the anchor and pressing the hands into those anchors. Switch sides. One more. And then straightening out the legs, keeping them nice and wide. folding forward at the hips. If the knees need to bend, then they need to bend. Otherwise, working your hands towards the ground. And then we'll start with one hand tented on the floor in front of your face, and then a little bit of rotation, reaching the opposite arm up. You could then float the hand, keeping the rotation there with the strength of your torso. You could also reach that hand that was floating off the floor towards the opposite foot. You could keep it floating, or you could give it a little bit of contact without gripping onto it to drive a little bit more rotation. After the breath that you're on, come on back to the middle, switch hands, start with a tented hand just under the face on the floor, lift the opposite arm up, and then float the hand away from the ground. The hand that is floating, you could leave it there, or you might reach it towards the opposite foot, or maybe make light contact with that foot, if any. Hold here for a couple of breaths. And then after the breath that you're on, come on back out. Walk the feet back together. Come on part way up, pause there if you need to. And then come to the top of the mat, if you have a mat. Stand with the feet close together and then bend into the knees. Be generous with that bend into the knees, and then we're going to rotate the torso. You might find that there's a tendency towards gripping the elbow and the knee together, and whilst that's okay, today we're not going to do that. We're actually going to drive rotation from the middle of our body and see if we can maybe tap the elbow to the knee, but instead of using the elbow and the knee contact to drive rotation, we're trying to drive the rotation from the middle of our body. So rotate through the torso, keep the knees glued together, and hover the elbow and knee away from one another. One more breath. On the next inhalation, come on up. And then set yourself up for the second side. Bend into the knees. Start to rotate. Think about the knees staying glued together. And try to maybe tap the elbow and knee together, but don't let them stay in contact. Let this rotation be driven through the effort of the torso. 2 more breaths. On your next inhalation, stand on up, and then fold at the top. Take a deep breath in and come halfway out. Press the hands down, step back to your plank. And then instead of moving through a regular flow, we're just going to move in reverse. So come to the tops of the feet and really slowly lower through the pelvis. This is going to drive a nice slow movement through the spine. As the hips get lower towards the floor, think about lifting them up a little bit and pulling the sternum in through the arms. And then really slowly bend the elbows, lower halfway, untuck the toes, push up to a plank, and then to a downward facing dog. Take another breath here, and then lower yourself all the way down to a seated position. In that seated position, bend one knee in towards your hips. The idea is you also want the hips to be a little bit angled open. Turn the torso towards the bent knee, and then lateral flexion of the spine towards the straight leg. Thinking about shoulder to knee. You may like to bring the top arm overhead. You may like to bring it up to the sky or towards that straight leg foot. Where normally we would stay still in a position like that to get a nice stretch, today, in keeping with everything else that we're doing, what I would recommend is a little bit of movement towards the end of that range to keep it active, or if your hands are in contact with some support, hover them off the floor so that we have to do the work to support ourselves there in that place. Three more breaths here. Again, either hovering stationarily or a little bit of oscillation in and out of those shapes. One more. And then we switch sides. Utilizing any props that you need to get you into this position, maybe some kind of blanket underneath the tush, and then rotating towards the bent knee, and then lateral flexion towards the straight leg. Again, you can bring that second arm overhead, or you can bring it all the way towards the straight leg foot. And then instead of staying there today, we're going to make it a little bit more dynamic, moving in and out of this shape, or hovering all support away from the ground or away from other body parts, so that we have to do the work to keep ourselves there. Two more breaths. And then after those breaths, we're going to come on down to the floor. Get there nice and slowly. And then we're going to take some kind of a supine twist. Move the hips off to one side and then the knees off to the other side in your twist. You might also need to do a little shimmy of the shoulders. And this one now, to finish the practice, we're going to just stay still. So find a twist, pause there, take a few nice deep breaths. In and out through the nose, of course. And then if you want to stay there longer, you can. Otherwise, take a moment to head towards the opposite twist. Move the hips off to the side, and then the knees go the opposite direction. Maybe a little shift to the shoulders as well. And then hang out there in your twist for a few breaths. Again, you can stay there as long as you like. When you are ready to, you can unravel the twist and set yourself up for a final position of rest, whatever that may look like for you. And just take a few minutes there just to wind down from your movement practice. I'm going to leave you to do that at home. Thank you so much for joining me in this movement practice, and I hope to see you again in another video very soon.